Well, good afternoon. My name is Gregory Seltz. I'm the Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty, and this is our live Liberty Alert that we have every Wednesday. And today's topic is Christians among the rage, maybe even say Christians among the chaos. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. How can we be part of the solution going forward? We're going to talk about hearing and speaking and living the truth. You know, truth matters, especially now, and getting at the truth is so key. But not only hearing that, then living it, embodying it for the sake of others, and doing it not for just our protection, but for our ministry and our service to others. Talk about the pandemics, the crisis, and why living freely is still the only answer. We're going to talk about that. And then, of course, the issue that's going on right now, race, structure, and real change. And we're going to revisit the words of Frederick Douglass at the time of the Dred Scott decision, a horrible Supreme Court decision, which I still say, you know, the foundations of that decision are still plaguing us today. The idea of master race, of Darwinian survival of the fittest, the secularism that has replaced kind of the biblical notion of the inherent dignity of humanity. That was what was going on there, and that's been embodied in politics, in at least one frame of politics. And it's a supremacist notion today, although it doesn't focus on the color of the skin. It still focuses on those ideological roots, those Darwinian roots. And like I said last time, if you're a Darwinian, that's the ideology of racism, and that I believe that needs to be rooted out of our culture. Now that's a discussion that's going to take some real a deep dive, if you will. Now, before we get started, a couple things. There will be some documents that we're going to post. I think that will be helpful to you. So again, you know, at lcrlfreedom.org, that's where all of our resources can be found. You'll even be able to find, if you can't find it on Facebook, you'll be able to find our video live alert too there. But some good books. First of all, The Quest for Cosmic Justice by Thomas Sowell. I love Thomas Sowell, his book Ethnic America, his other book A Conflict of Visions. I think they're must-reads. He's not writing from a Christian perspective, but he is writing from a perspective I think we all need to have, which is humanity limited or is humanity unlimited in its abilities? And as Christians, we know the teaching is the total depravity of man. Human beings were created in the image of God, but they have broken that image. And now we lust for power. We don't lust for service. And our founding fathers understood that. And Sowell does too. But most of our kids are being taught that human beings are unlimited, that we can do whatever we want if we just have the right technology and the right structure. So there are kids right now that are burning our cities down who believe they're doing a good thing because they believe even if there's no structure, they really believe this. They've been taught this. If there's no structure, human beings, that'll be better for us because we're good by nature and we'll do the good things when we don't have all these coercive, systemically bad structures around us. Well, that's crazy. If we're limited, sinful people, that just really opens up the Pandora's box of corrupt people being able to do whatever they want as long as they have more power than you. And so again, Sowell writes this from a more sociological perspective, a more historical perspective. Those books will be very helpful to you. Also, Free to Believe by Luke Goodrich. I think that's still a key. The battle over religious liberty, why it matters. I'm going to make the argument today a little bit that religious liberty is the key to everybody's liberty. And so for those of you who think that religious liberty is less a big concern than the issues we're dealing with this week, you're wrong. Because religious liberty undergirds those others, and once that gives way, there's no politics that can save us. If you're looking for facts on a lot of the issues, and I really do think we need to know what we're talking about if we're talking about change, then Heather Mcdonald, pretty much anything she writes is very, very good. The Burden of Bad Ideas is the book I'm reading right now. And, she's accused of being gosh, I don't even want to get into what she's accused of. Her passion was she wanted to be helpful and useful in her work to urban communities. She wanted to empower them. That's basically the same thing. The reason I wrote my PhD stuff, I wanted to see what were the solutions that even if people didn't join my church, these would still be better for them. Well, she writes kind of out of that same passion, and yet she's accused of being exactly the opposite of that. Well, she's got a lot of information in there, and you can make your own decisions going forward. And then Out of the Ashes, Rebuilding the American Culture. Again, folks, why is it important to be involved in these cultural issues? I mean, if a lot of people say, well, the church should just preach the gospel. Well, again, if religious liberty gives way and the culture becomes totally antithetical to the ideals that even undergird our temporal liberties, it's going to be harder and harder to preach the good news of the eternal liberties of Jesus Christ. Yeah, again, I know biblically there's a time coming when we're going to suffer for our faith, just for being Christians. But when you have the liberties that you have in America, to push back on that while you still can freely preach the good news of the gospel, what a blessing that is. So I think it's worthy. There are some things worth fighting for, and of course there are other things that we have to serve into people's lives. And then the last thing I'm going to do is there's a book called The U.S. Constitution and Other Writings, and this is where I'm going to read Frederick Douglass's response, and I think that'll be helpful to us. One other thing that'll be posted, we have a letter from Josh Howley from Missouri. It's a great letter about, he's talking about the issues that are going on with religious liberty and how it's an infringement on all of our liberties. He wants them to be investigated, the stuff that the overreach of these states. And so we'll post his letter on our website. And then I've also written a letter to our senators, congressmen, to the White House, and also to our Attorney General and the DOJ, again about religious liberty and its exercise being essential for the solutions we need today. How many of you know this? Okay, we're a Lutheran church. How many of you know that we came to America in 1839 looking for religious liberty? We were persecuted. Our religious liberties were persecuted at home in Germany. So we came to America. 5 ships, 700 people. Came and they wound up landing. Only 4 of them made it. One went down in the ocean. And 700 people, 600 made it. And they then, for the next 10 years, tried to survive as they moved from Louisiana all the way up to St. Louis. So just about the time we probably got our sea legs in America, the Civil War breaks out. But I argued in this that we've always been, some people say, well, you're a white church. Well, no, we're technically an ethnocentric church. Now, that's got its problems too. But what I mean by that is we felt that we would come here, and Germans generally tried to just take care of everything. They didn't want any help from they were happy to be free. So they built their churches, they built their schools, they built hospitals, they built their publishing house, they built all these different things. They built universities, assisted living, adoption agencies, nursing homes. We built all that ourselves. We didn't ask for anybody's help in that. We have our own banks, we have our own insurance companies, we have our own investment companies. We felt that we were supposed to be useful and we were supposed to not take advantage of the culture in which we lived. Now that's a good survival strategy in a culture. And you can see that all over the place. In fact, Hitler abused that as he tried to nationalize the Germans. That's a whole nother discussion. But my point is this terrible mission strategy. And we've had to struggle with that. To actually become useful in God's hands in America, we actually had to go through World War I and World War II, where our own culture was against us being who we are, and we had to go fight the homeland to prove we were good Americans. How many of you knew that that Nebraska, back in the 30s, sued the Lutheran Church? Why did they sue us? And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. They sued us because we wanted to speak German in our homes and German in our churches and in our schools. And Nebraska said, no, you've got to speak English. Well, we won. So I always tell people when they're talking about, say, the Mexican churches or the other Hispanic churches in America, they want we had to learn to speak English for business so we could survive in this country and be useful in this country as citizens. But we still wanted to maintain our home language, our faith language as best we could. Ultimately, we were kind of forced to assimilate through World War II, and we anglicized everything. But for some of you who don't know us, we even had a thing called the English Synod to reach those English-speaking people because they were so strange to us, even in this English-speaking land. So again, we've gone through a lot of these issues as we've tried to just be ourselves, but also to be faithful to God, and then to be good citizens, and there's a tension in that. So Christians among the rage, because that's what's going on our streets. Thanks for tuning in. Please keep these Please keep sharing these Liberty alerts, because that's the way that people are really starting to get this. If you can't check in at the live alerts, you can always share the post as it becomes available on Facebook, or you can go to our webpage and see the videos. Give out this website, lcrfreedom.org, to others. There's a place on the website too if you want to donate to us. I also found out that when you hit the donate button, it comes up and it says send by mail. Well, if you just hit the donate button, you can also donate with your credit card if you want online as well. We really can't do this without you, so please be a part of us, because we represent you in Washington, D.C. Religious liberty, sanctity of life, fighting for the institution of marriage as something that we can embody, if you will, as well as teach for the civility of our culture, and also educational freedom. All right, what a week. Protests, misinformation again. This is what's killing me. You got to get to the information if you're going to make a good decision. Rioting, looting, officers murdered too, the way forward, what to do. And then, of course, peaceful protests amidst it all. We're going to talk about the three things, but let's start with the COVID-19 news, because there has been stuff in the news on that. I think the jig is up. The shutdowns are political. They are not medical. Even the World Health Organization came out with a ruling now that, remember, we were also frightened. We were frightened because we thought that there were people out there who didn't even know they had it, and that this disease was so communicable that they were giving it to people unbeknownst to themselves. And so we had to lock down. We had to all just go into our homes. Well, now they're finding out that that's absolutely not true. This virus does not spread. It spreads symptomatically, not asymptomatically. Again, that's the science. Well, that means healthy people, what are they doing in their homes? They should be going back to work. They should be going back to worship. They should be going back to the things that really matter, because we need to be hard at work to empower and to give us capacity to deal with the things that are coming against us in this world. And so, again, if you are sick and you put something on, that way you can't cough it on other folks, pretty much. That's the best solution. And I guess if you want to wear a mask so that you don't inhale it or something like that, okay. But that's it. Social distancing. But again, it has to do with symptomatic spreading. So again, we're starting to see that that the data that we were given early on was wrong. But now the overreaction is very much wrong. And if you're at home because you're afraid, you're being taught that fear, because that fear does not exist in the virus itself. Now, the protests and the riots have really made a mockery of a lot of this political stuff, because I think Michigan had some kind of thing you could only still have 10, maybe 20 people in a worship. Well, suddenly, overnight, if you're protesting and rioting, 100 people. And then how many of those people got arrested for spreading the virus? And just a week earlier, a black politician, sent policemen to an African-American church on the south side of Chicago, threatened them with jail, gave them all $500 tickets. Why? For gathering in worship. We now know that is an abuse of power like no other, and she had no right to do that, because we have protections for religious liberty and religious exercise, and now there's absolutely no reason why we can't manage that. So when we look at these things that are happening, the only thing that's changed from 2 weeks ago to today is the politics. And now it doesn't look good to start arresting people who are doing what they're doing in the streets around the country. Although they should be arrested for looting and the burning and all that kind of crazy stuff, but they're not. Well, they are, but they're getting right back out again. That's another discussion about foolish policies in the city. But the biggest threat to our freedoms is the weaponization of politics and the politicization, the making political almost every aspect of our lives. That is something that is a threat to all of our liberties. Every one of you, even if you're a non-believer, if you're not a Christian, but if you're a Christian, you need to understand that is a huge threat to your ability to be a Christian freely in the society in which we live. Now, religious liberty news, the churches are opening up, but the closure and the ideas that the church is a non-essential entity, those things are going to linger. Those things are going to linger. In the next crisis that comes up, you're going to see people much more easily compliant to that. And I think that's something that needs to be fought against. because worship is not just you going for a self-help moment in time. Worship is a fundamental way we look at life. The ability to humble ourselves before that which is greater than us. The ability to be motivated and encouraged to serve others that need to be served, even if it's inconvenient for us. The ability to stand for justice when an injustice is done. All that stuff comes from being in the presence of God and in the presence of His Word. Religion is more than just another version of self-help. And again, this is where our founding fathers, even those that were not necessarily as Christian as the others, they saw the moral structure even of Christ's teachings as absolutely unique in all of the world and motivating us. And the biggest worshiping community in the country at the time of the writing of the Constitution was in the Capitol. People don't know this. They worshiped in the Capitol. So again, as we think about this, thanks to God, I think you have to give thanks to God for the present administration. Whatever you think of this guy that's the president, he has been tremendous on religious liberty. And the Attorney General has been tremendous on religious liberty. And just saying to some of these people who are abusing that notion, you don't have the right to do that. And that's what we need in our politicians. We don't want them living our lives, but we want them protecting our ability to live faithful lives in service to others. Senator Langford is now pushing something that we talked about. There's another COVID-19 bill coming. Those of us who are kind of skittish about the government becoming the benefactor of all of us, we're a little bit worried about this becoming kind of the impulse through every crisis. But Senator Langford's push is to say, instead of the government giving stuff, which they have to take from people before they give, how about we expand the charitable giving provisions? Because that was my biggest beef with the Tax Reform Act, is how they made it easier to do taxes, but they took away people's incentive to be generous to churches, schools, other 501c3s that they were passionate about. Right now it's limited to $300 for this year only if you file the standard deduction. And Senator Langford's push is to expand that to $4,000 this year for an individual, or $8,000 a year for people, even if you don't itemize. And that is a huge thing. It's going to be very helpful to churches and schools who are going to really, again, we should give just because it's the right thing to do. I get that. But incentivizing the right thing to do is also a helpful thing. And so Langford's amendment is something I'll be looking for it. If it passes, I will let you know. Okay? And then, again, we've sent a letter to various agencies talking about our religious liberty and why that is essential, not to us surviving in this culture, but to all of us surviving and thriving together. All right, the big deal for, again, today is how can we respond to what's happening in our streets as Christian two-kingdom citizens? Okay, march in peace. And by all accounts, this event, which was a tragic injustice to George Floyd, by all accounts, it is being handled well. The police were arrested, and then the federal government was on this right from the go. In fact, they actually brought more charges, or they got the charges amped up to second-degree murder for the person who kneeled on the neck of George Floyd. And then all the other people were arrested too. And I don't know if it's negligent homicide, but that was coming from the White House, and that was coming from the DOJ. And so for those of you who are marching in peace, there is a response that is happening. I do believe that peaceful response to this issue is being hijacked for other things, and I think there's a certain amount of pushback that needs to happen on some of those things that are falsely being hoisted upon this issue. That's the discussion going forward. The hijacking of the marches for an uncritical, what I mean by that people aren't really thinking through what's being asked, demanding of systemic change that is coming because of the violence and the looting and even the murder. Well, that's a different ballgame. You respond that way, that becomes the political way of doing things. And again, that's not the way we make systemic change. And again, I know people are saying, well, they're frustrated, but you're never frustrated. Rage and the kind of things that I'm seeing on the news, that's not rage coming out of what happened to George Floyd. That's opportunity because the police won't push back to take whatever you want. And that has always got to be a bad thing. And we should all be standing up against that as well. So I think we need an engagement of these things and a clarity of thought. And so I'm going to try to at least help with some ideas and some principles that will help you sift through what is being said and what's going on out there. And just to let you know, principles versus party. A lot of times we get aligned with because we're basically a conservative church, and we believe in these fundamental issues, religious liberty, which again is a biblical worldview, and that's what the argument of Luke Gingrich, who's a lawyer for the Becket Fund, but he argues that free to believe, this is a biblical view of life. So if you love if you love liberty at all, if you love your personal liberties, there's a lot of countries that don't have it because it flows from a worldview, and that worldview comes from the Judeo-Christian ethics. So that's a great book to read there. But principles versus party. The Republican Party oftentimes says it believes in these things, but then it won't fight for them when it really matters, and it really irritates the heck out of me, especially when I see that it is good for empowering even minority neighborhoods and things like that. And so why don't you fight for these principles if they really work? Because you start saying no to certain constituencies, and when you start saying no to anybody, people don't like to do that politically. They'd rather say yes to everybody. But libertinism doesn't work for anybody. But my biggest beef right now is a political party that is secular progressive, and they're completely open about it. And folks, if they're secular progressive, that means they don't have any room for the church. There's no higher authority than the state. They don't believe in the nuclear family. In fact, they believe cradle to grave that you should give your kids over health care, education. In fact, they'll feed them. They'll take care of them completely, and they'll also start to teach them what it means to be a good citizen of a all-powering state. That's not what we want. We want liberty for people to live empowered lives, faithfully, humbly, in service to their friends, neighbors, and family. And so it really bugs me. And I'm going to say this, but I'm just going to say it out loud. It bugs me that the very party of Jim Crow, the party of the KKK, the party of the white supremacy of Margaret Sanger, who created Planned Parenthood, and the white supremacy of Woodrow Wilson and his progressive takeover of the Supreme Court, the originators of the last 55 years of bad urban public policy that has not only destroyed the family, destroyed the family in the urban centers of our country. They literally run every major city in our country, and they've destroyed the black family, but now also the Hispanic family and the white family. The numbers are 80% run by without no fathers in the home, 60 and 40. That's how the numbers, and they're all on the rise. And they've trapped the children of those situations in an educational system that prepares them only for more dependency, and they control virtually all the cities. And then to see those people who espouse those principles kneeling as if they're the saviors of this, that takes a lot of gall. And so if we're going to have an honest discussion about this, we've got to talk about some of those reasons why we're in the predicament that we're in. So ask yourself, what actions empower people? And when I worked in the city, and when I trained people to work in the city, what I found out is actions that empowered families and kept them together, actions that allowed them to purchase their own homes and actually have their own stuff, if you will, which is fundamental to their freedoms, access to a competitive education where they could take that education wherever they want. Once you start espousing those things, you find out that those who want to keep people dependent get really mad at that. And that's kind of what I think is going to be the issue going forward. Now, a couple of things. We need clarity. And clarity is necessary. You need to know what we're talking about, not slogans. You need to know what we're talking about if we're going to make huge structural changes. And so I'm always, no matter what you say the origins of the problem are, I still want to know what are your solutions, okay? What are your solutions? Because that's when we start to see what is really happening. Right now there's a couple of articles, and I'll try to post these on our website too. I go to the Wall Street Journal on a lot of these things. It's kind of a pretty reasoned way of addressing a lot of these issues, and I find that it's pretty well balanced. But again, you got to check your sources on all these things. But there's one out right now by Jason Riley, The Full Truth About Race and Policing. I think that's a helpful thing to read because it kind of puts the context into this discussion. That's really important. And this is the one I've done this research. My PhD thesis is 300 pages and 1,000 footnotes. And my biggest point was a lot of the policies of the last 50 years have actually disempowered the very people that they were meant to help. I'll even give you another example. How many of you know, because this is another principal issue, minimum wage. Most people say, minimum wage, that helps the poor. It does not. It doesn't. And how many of you knew the origins of minimum wage was racist? You know, I always say Planned Parenthood. The whole goal of Planned Parenthood was to kill black people especially, but poor people too. It was a white supremacist notion, and it grew out of this Darwinian understanding that human beings were only as useful, as if they were ahead of the Darwinian curve. Why are people laying down their lives for this ideology when, in reality, they've been the ones that have tried to keep people down for over 100 years and even more? This one's called America's New Nihilism, and it's by Daniel Henninger, and he's talking about the policies that have encased people. Those policies do need to be changed. I really believe that. But no one's talking about those policies. Even if I don't have any problem with the concept of limiting the police's role in a community. Getting rid of the police is crazy because, well, we'll get to that in a minute. But and I don't think that's what they want to do. But again, the notion of these policies, we can limit the police, but you still have to replace it with something. These are the same people that they're going to limit the police, but they're also going to do what? They're going to not empower people in the Second Amendment to take care of their own house. So think of the actions these folks are taking and whether they empower you or they don't. And so those are two good articles. We need clarity. We need information. Also, remember last week we talked about this. The issues are not left and right. And you've been kind of taught to think that way because it's expedient for those in power. But the issues are not left and right. They are empowerment. There's a continuum of empowerment. And it's state over here, very limited freedoms for you as an individual, or very limited state and more freedoms for you as an individual. That's the continuum. And all the people on the left side, if you will, the statist side. So you've got the fascist version of that, you've got the socialist version of that, you've got the communist version of that, you've got the ethnic version of that, but they're all big state run by a few people. And we stand against that, and our Constitution stands against that and tries to empower individuals to live disciplined, virtuous, religious lives in community for one another. So this defund the police movement, it's a radical restructuring. And it comes from some people. There are some people I do think believe this, that if you got rid of all structures, we would have a better world because we're by nature good people. Well, that always turns into tyranny because we're not by nature a good people, and power limited in only a few people's hands becomes tyranny for the rest of us, and poverty for the rest of us, and violence for the rest of us. And so again, we need to actually fight back against this because it will create even more chaos, not just for our culture. It's going to create chaos for the people that supposedly it was meant to help. Remember, I just told you about that minimum wage. It was actually instituted to keep white people, to give white people jobs and to prevent black people from getting jobs. Because at the time of its institution, African Americans had more a percentage of employment than white people did. And they took lesser wages, which is one of the reasons why they were employed more. And the white folks who didn't want to take those wages were mad, so they got minimum wage. It was meant to keep black people out of the workforce. And it still functions the same way, because what it does is it actually creates a higher cost of business for businesses, and it gives some people more money, but it actually causes other people to lose their jobs. And then the other thing is it causes everybody else who gets paid an hourly wage to get a raise without having to talk about it. Because you can say, well, the raise was given to them, not me. But in reality, everybody gets it, and all those costs are raised. So again, let's talk about what it actually does, because that's really what we need to do going forward. Some principles then to help guide our thinking. I'm going to say it again, and this is going to be hard to hear, but God is at work. He's at work right now to preserve the world through good government, which means we have to engage these issues for the sake of good government, and we have to engage it for the sake of the communities and other people's communities too, because we want them to have the basic things that make our country what it is. And he's at work to also save through the unique message of the gospel. And America's still one of the great places to live because you have freedom not only to do what you wish. And by the way, the Founding Fathers meant freedom to live a virtuous life, not to do anything you wanted. Okay, that's another discussion. But again, free to do the right thing, free to be faithful, free to be moral, free to be virtuous was a much better way to live than to be totally coerced because you're trying to do whatever you want. The second thing is, and we're going to talk more about this, speak the truth in love. Put to work what you know to be true. And there's a biblical dimension to that. So we've got to be well-versed in the Scriptures, the moral teachings of the Scriptures. But then also when it comes to engaging the world, we've got to put on our critical thinking caps and ask, what's going on here? So when a government official says, I want to take care of you and I want to make sure that you're blessed and taken care of, you have to ask, do they have the power to do that? And what are their methodologies for doing that? And if I ask a politician to actually give my liberties back to me, am I willing to take up those liberties? So I don't really need that politician. And you can start to see how these things play themselves out, because politicians are people of power. They extract money from us, and then they actually start to use that money to increase their power and in some ways help people. But generally speaking, the minute you are dependent on them for the main things of life, that is historically a terrible position to be in for people who yearn for liberty. The big issue for me right now is, I wrote a paper on this, and I'll post this too, and it's a mom and pop paper called No More Euphemisms, Diphemisms, or Demonizations. And we're back exactly at that. We have people being demonized. We have people, there's euphemisms out there, what people are doing and they're actually the opposite of what's happening. And then the demonization stuff, where if people actually have a different opinion of how to actually accomplish something that we're both talking about, you're not given that ability to speak. That is not a good thing. And that will not protect your liberty or my liberty or anybody's liberty. And it sure is not going to solve the issues that we're talking about right now. So if you think about that no more euphemisms, we start to differentiate things. So yes, stand up for black civil rights. And in this particular case, it's very specific. So we can talk about how it's specific to African Americans because of what happened to George Floyd. We can talk about that. But we can also say no to this BLM thing. Because that, if you read what's on the Black Lives Matter website, it's a Marxist, anti-police, anti-nuclear family, anti-church, anti-free market, LGBTQ activist group, I believe hiding behind civil rights. Test me on that. Go look it up. And there's people who've written on this stuff much more in depth than I have. But again, when I look at this, I'm saying, that's not the solution. That is not the way I want to go with the solution. I want more clarity about what these actions actually are going to do. So when you hear these people say defund the police, and they're starting to defund the police, and they're going to actually talk about this. I think Trump's got something coming out too, where he's going to talk about reform with the police, and empowering the neighborhood, but then he's also going to talk about how the neighborhood needs to rise up to the level of self-government and all that. I think that's coming out. I haven't seen it yet, so I'm not going to speak about it, but I just saw that coming in my box before our talk today. But again, when we look at this, demand clarity. Demand what these actions, what are they trying to do? Now, I don't for a minute think people believe we can exist without a police force of some kind. But the police forces as they stand are supposed to be representative of all of us, something we can all hold accountable. If you defund them all, then they're going to be localized militias, and they're going to be localized militias of the people in power. And you don't want that. I don't want that. What we really want is a police force that's limited in its scope, that weeds out what I heard the number was like less than 1% of the bad apples, but that still can create a lot of havoc in our culture. And then again, self-government and the Second Amendment rights of self-protection. You put those two things together, limit not only the power of the police, but the power of that local government in your life, you're going to have some good things that'll happen. And neighborhoods are going to spring back to life. I saw it happen. I lived that in New York. I lived it. When Giuliani actually, the broken glass theory, when he actually arrested the low-level criminals, he really went after the criminals. free people started coming out again in their neighborhoods. They were not afraid to ride the subways anymore. They were not afraid of people. And I'm black and white. Experienced that. So again, when we look at this, demand clarity of action before you acquiesce to the bumper sticker. And know what you're actually saying. Again, the police stuff, when we start to talk about locking them completely down, that's exactly what happened after Ferguson. And that Ferguson is my case study in my paper. That's exactly what happened, is that police did not police the neighborhoods. And I keep thinking of the African American families in the city, or the poor white families or Hispanic families who need justice. They need protection from criminal elements in their communities. And the police now are not responding. The criminality exploded. Violent crime exploded in those neighborhoods. That's called the Ferguson Effect. So you voted with your heart something you thought was the right answer, but it created even more havoc for the people who were vulnerable. We want to be smarter than that. So reflect before you acquiesce and act. So this kind of uncritical thinking is plaguing us right now. I'll give you another example of that. You know, Planned Parenthood. When you think about what is Planned Parenthood, the euphemism is choice. We choose, and what's wrong with choosing? It's freedom. Or they'll say, Planned Parenthood, we're going to prepare you for parenthood. That's not what they do at all. I just got out of a meeting yesterday where we were talking about Planned Parenthood in the House, the Values Action Team of the House. Abortions are now 40% chemical. They're just sending the pills to people. People are then having these abortions at home with all the ravages that happen when it's So you talk about caring for a woman's life. They're not preparing her for motherhood. They're not preparing her for parenthood. They're not doing any of that. They're making sure that those children are exterminated so that people can be even more dependent on the things that they sell. And when you think about that, that's what they do. And I just saw another article that they're selling baby parts still. This is an egregious thing in our culture. And by the way, if they can keep selling these pills, people can take them whenever they want. Late trimester abortions, all these different things. And the physiology to the women is terrible. And then think about this. I never thought about this. When children, what happens with those remains? A lot of those remains are being flushed down the toilet. They're being thrown out in the garbage. And the drugs that are being used are going into our water supply. And there's already ramifications to that. When you go to a hospital and you have an amputation of your leg, when you leave the hospital, they don't give you your leg and say, you dispose of it. They actually have to take care of that in a very specific way because for the protection of the rest of society. These Planned Parenthood people could care less about that. And again, but the euphemism is Planned Parenthood. Prenatal care, which they don't do. Preparing you for parenting, they don't do it. They are an abortion provider. So again, get past the platitude and get to the point. Past the platitude and then get to the attitude. And the attitude is we should be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. I've seen a lot of harmless as doves activity lately, and that's usually a very good thing when you're trying to share your faith. But when you're engaging these cultural issues with the people of power, you've got to be smarter about these things. Wise as serpents, even Jesus would say. Government policy is not about service, it's about power that has service elements to it. So be wise in what you think is being concocted because you'll be disappointed when you see what actually happens. When I thought about urban work and I thought about empowerment, I wanted to know why no charter schools. Why? Why did the federal government, and I think this was under the Obama administration, why did they shut down all the charter schools when they were empowering low-income workers and their families to send their kids to better schools? Why? Parental choice, equal access, that's the key to helping people get a good education and help them get out of poverty. Why no policies undergirding the family and incentivizing them to stay together rather than not? More money and power and chaos and keeping people attached to the government? No. Why no teaching of civics that emphasizes the beauty of the freedoms that you have and the responsibilities and the effort that's required for self-government? When we start to talk about this, yes, we have civil rights, but there's responsibility in that. And so what are those responsibilities? And if you don't do those responsibilities, what happens to your civil rights or what happens to the culture? Those in power are much more apt to want you to be dependent, because then you need them. And these are the issues I kept running into in the city. If you empower the neighborhood, you empower the families, you empower them, they need the aldermen less. They need the government less. And they even need the police force less. So there you can limit the police's intrusion into their life as well. This is kind of a funny, Rich Coors and Carol, but Rich he works with me here at LCRL. And I was talking about wise as serpents, harmless as doves, and he said, hey, in Michigan they changed the capacity of the religious liberty stuff from 10 to 100 overnight because of the protests. And he said, we as the Lutheran Church were the original protestants. So he said, why don't we call ourselves, the protestants, and then just open our churches too? I thought that was kind of funny. Wise as serpents, I don't know, we'll see if he can get away with it. So finally, just remember that religious liberty undergirds and empowers everybody's liberty. James Madison said, if you have a publicly incorporated church that's free of government intrusion and a government publicly incorporated, those two incorporations will allow the place of conscience or religious liberty of the individual citizen. If the church gets knuckled under or it gets treated like it's no big deal, then all we're left with is the absolute power of the state. And you're starting to see what states can do. They can willfully let things happen, and then they can pull it all back, all to their advantage. We don't like any of that. We don't like any of that for any neighborhood. So again, never forget that religious liberty undergirds, empowers, and protects all civil liberties. I wish we could talk more about this today, but that's what we teach in our Champions for Liberty events. So if you want to sign up your church or have a religious liberty weekend, we get more into that. But race and structure and structural change, our religious liberties are part of that solution, and that's why I read from Frederick Douglass. I was reading the Dred Scott decision again. When people say the Supreme Court said it must be true. Well, Dred Scott was bad law. Thank God we overturned it, but it actually took a civil war to fully engage the question. But he makes the argument in his writings that the Supreme Court got it wrong. But it got it wrong both according to the laws of God and got it wrong according to the Constitution. And so he was saying, I don't want anything more than what the Constitution already gives, what my relationship as a creature of God already gives me, and the Constitution undergirds and protects. And he said this, he said the Constitution, as well as the Declaration of Independence and the sentiments even of the founders of the Republic, give us a platform broad enough and strong enough to support the comprehensive plans for the freedom and elevation of all people in this country without regard to color, class, or clime. And then he even said, when you talk about chaos, and we're hearing people talk about chaos today, burn it all down, he said slavery lives and flourishes best in the absence of civilization. So he didn't want the Union dissolved anymore. That was the big issue with Abe Lincoln. But people say, well, why not dissolve it if slavery is the issue? Well, they were trying to get rid of it while maintaining the Union, because the Union actually provided the freedoms, ultimately, that all could finally aspire to. And then he just talked about how the church, at the time, the church was generally speaking anti-slavery at the time of the Constitution. And he said the church, the teaching of the Scriptures, and the Constitution, all those things together were the things he knew would eventually wipe this whole thing off the face of the planet, or at least within this culture. Because you couldn't live up to your own values and maintain slavery or a devolution of humanity. And that's my point. The religious notion of humanity, even its the inherent dignity, even the idea of its depravity, those are the things that are going to keep us from becoming the worst human beings we can be. And Darwin's survival of the fittest, it cannot do that. And social Darwinism cannot do that. Nietzsche cannot do this. And this idea that we will have all these morals if there is no God above us, it's not going to happen. I love how he concludes. He said, let me say this, I ask of the American people that they might live up to the Constitution, adopt its principles. And that's kind of what we're talking about. There are principles there that are foundational that will help us see through this and help us support and serve one another as American citizens. He said, imbibe its spirit, enforce its provisions. When this is done, the wounds of my bleeding people will be healed. The chain will no longer rust on their ankles. The liberty, the glorious birthright of our common humanity. And again, that's something we emphasize in the Judeo-Christian worldview. Social Darwinism does not. Supremacy, white supremacy, or any supremacy does not. The glorious birthright of our common humanity will become the inheritance of all this highly favored country. So even at the Dred Scott ruling, this is what Douglass is telling us. This is what we've got to rise up to. And eventually that Dred Scott ruling, thank God, was overturned. Amendments were added to the Constitution. But there's been bad rulings since. The sanctity of life in Roe v. Wade is a bad ruling, just like, in my mind, Dred Scott and what it was meant to actually accomplish. And even the religious liberty rulings that are still going on right now, we're really battling these things because it goes to the heart and soul of what a free people can do for each other. So in the middle of this, it's harder. This is tougher to do than, it's easier said than done. Let me just say this. Try to keep thinking these things through. Think these things through. We write every Friday. We try to apply it to issues that are going on so that we give you abilities to actually start to say that, well, this is a good way to think it through and a good way to start to act on it and be useful to God in His preserving work and useful to God in proclaiming His saving work. I just remember when I was an athlete back in the day, and when I played basketball, we get to these big games. And the big games, you always got nervous. I don't care who it is. I don't care if you're Michael Jordan. You get nervous before the big game because there's a lot riding on it. But what do you do at that moment? You reflect back on how you practiced. And those who practiced hard, those who actually went at it in practice, then when that big game came, it just wasn't as overwhelming because you were prepared for the moment. So the drills, the attention to the skills, the passing, shooting, defense, ball handling, the wind sprints, free throws when you were exhausted. So here's some principles to start really thinking through when you are exhausted emotionally, when you're exhausted spiritually, when you see the country exhausted. There's a God in heaven who gives us wisdom. He tells us how He preserves things. He tells us how He saves things, and He tells us try to be useful in His hands for the sake of others. And to that end, that's why you need to go to church, you need to read your Bible, you need to think these things through so when the time comes for you to be a courageous voice for the sake of others, you can be just that. So some thoughts I hope that'll help you as you start to work through these issues and you start to think these things through. God bless your day as Christians who are courageous among the rage, seeking peace and justice on God's terms and God's way. So not just for ourselves. As I said, our Lutheran heritage was that we knew how to take care of each other. And that was a good thing when we moved into a new country and tried to just take care of our own. That is a helpful thing. It helps you survive and even thrive in a new country. It's not a good mission strategy. And overall, it's really not a good political strategy either. So to that end, let's put to use what we have learned so we can be useful in God's hands to others. 2, kingdom citizenship, for the sake of culture and the church. God bless you and have a great week. Take care.